The colony ship Endurance moved silently through the darkness of space. It was the year 2347, and humanity had finally reached beyond the solar system. 3,000 souls slept in cryogenic chambers, while the ship carried them toward a new home. Captain Daniel Harper stood on the bridge and watched the stars pass by on the main screen. He had dreamed of this moment since he was a child growing up in a small town in Ohio. Now he was leading humanity's first true colony mission to another star system, communications. Officer Laura Mitchell sat at her station running routine diagnostics when something strange appeared on her screen. A signal was sweeping across their sensors. It was not random noise from distant stars. It was structured and mathematical and far too complex to be natural. Her heart began to beat faster as she ran the signal through every filter she had. The patterns repeated with perfect precision. Someone had sent this signal on purpose. She turned to Captain Harper with wide eyes and said that she was picking up something unusual. The captain walked to her station and looked at the data scrolling across her screen. He had been trained for many scenarios, but first contact with alien life was something no one truly expected to happen. He told her to wake the senior staff and get them to the bridge immediately. Within an hour, the bridge was full of people staring at screens and speaking in hushed voices. Chief Security Officer Nathan Cole stood near the weapons console with his arms crossed. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and scars on his hands from 20 years of military service. He did not like surprises, and this was the biggest surprise humanity had ever received. The alien ships appeared without warning. One moment the sensors showed empty space, and the next moment they showed 17 vessels surrounding the Endurance. The ships were black as obsidian and shaped like curved blades. They were beautiful in a terrible way. Each one was larger than the Endurance, and they moved with a grace that made human engineering look primitive. A transmission came through on all frequencies. The universal translator struggled for several seconds before producing words that everyone on the bridge could understand. The voice that spoke was cold and clicking like stones rattling in a metal box. It said that the Endurance was now property of the Valanthe Dominion. It said that resistance would result in extinction. It said that humans should prepare for boarding and inspection. Captain Harper felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face calm. He opened a channel and spoke in his most diplomatic voice. He introduced himself and explained that they came in peace. He said they were explorers seeking a new home and meant no harm to anyone. He asked if they could discuss the situation and reach an understanding between their peoples. The Valanthe laughed. The sound came through the speakers like bones cracking, and it made several crew members step backward in fear. The alien voice said that there was nothing to discuss. It said that the Dominion had conquered 17 star systems over 12,000 years. It said that every species they encountered became slaves or corpses. It asked which option the humans preferred. Before Captain Harper could respond, the first Valanthe boarding craft attached to the hull. The sound of metal cutting through metal echoed through the corridors. Nathan Cole ordered his security teams to defensive positions, but they had only sidearms and light armor. They had never expected to fight a war in space. The Valanthe soldiers were terrifying. They stood 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered in the emergency lighting. They had 4 arms, and each arm ended in claws that could tear through steel. They moved through the corridors with brutal efficiency, and they showed no mercy. Any human who raised a weapon was killed instantly. Any human who surrendered was bound with strange devices that wrapped around their necks, like collars. Laura Mitchell watched from her station as the bridge doors were blown open. She had seconds to act. Her fingers flew across her console as she composed a compressed burst transmission. She included everything: the coordinates of their location, images of the alien ships, recordings of the threatening messages, a simple plea for help. She aimed the transmission toward Earth and pressed send just as a Valanthe soldier grabbed her shoulder and threw her to the ground. Captain Harper was dragged from his chair and forced to his knees. A Valanthe officer walked onto the bridge and looked around with obvious contempt. This creature was different from the soldiers. It wore elaborate robes and carried a staff that glowed with inner light. It spoke, and the translator rendered its words with chilling clarity. It said that humans were weak and soft, but they would make acceptable laborers. It said that the Dominion always needed more workers for the mines. Nathan Cole struggled against the soldiers holding him. He shouted that Earth would come for them. He shouted that humanity would not accept this. The Valanthi officer walked over to him and pressed a button on its staff. The collar around Nathan's neck activated, and pain beyond anything he had ever experienced flooded his body. He screamed and collapsed in the Valanthi. Officer made that terrible clicking laugh again. The officer said that Earth was a single primitive planet with no military capability worth mentioning. It said that the Dominion had observed human space for years and found nothing threatening. It said that no rescue was coming. It said that these humans should accept their new lives as property of the Valanthi Dominion. The 3,000 colonists were removed from their cryogenic chambers and processed like cattle. Families were separated. Children were torn from their parents. The elderly and sick were taken to a separate ship, and no one ever saw them again. The colonists who remained were given numbers instead of names and loaded into transport vessels, Lara. Mitchell found herself in a holding cell with dozens of other crew members. Her transmission had gone out, but she did not know if it would ever reach Earth. The distance was vast, and the technology was experimental. But she held on to hope because hope was all she had left. Captain Harper was placed in isolation. The Valanthi considered him a leadership specimen, and they had special plans for such individuals. They believed that breaking the leaders would ensure compliance from everyone else. They had done this countless times with countless species. They had no reason to think humans would be different, but humans were different. As the transport ships carried them toward the heart of the Valanthi Dominion, the colonists began to whisper to each other. They passed messages through looks and gestures that their captors did not understand. They made promises in the darkness of the holding cells. They would survive. They would resist. They would wait for Earth to come. The transmission Laura had sent would take 11 years to reach home, traveling at faster-than-light communication speeds. 11 years was a long time to wait, but humanity had waited longer. Humanity had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed the species. Humanity knew how to endure, and humanity knew how to remember. Every cruelty the Valanthi inflicted would be recorded in the hearts of their captives. Every death would be mourned and avenged. Every chain would one day be broken. The Valanthi had made their first mistake by assuming that humans would break like every other species. They would eventually learn just how wrong they were. The stars continued to shine as the transport ships carried their human cargo deeper into enemy territory. Somewhere far behind them, a small blue planet orbited an ordinary yellow star. That planet had no idea what had happened to its children, but one day it would learn. And when it did, the galaxy would tremble. The transport ships arrived at Valanthos Prime after 3 weeks of travel. The human prisoners were marched through massive processing facilities, where they stood in lines alongside creatures from dozens of conquered worlds. Some of these aliens had tentacles instead of arms. Some had hard shells covering their bodies. Some had shapes that human eyes could barely understand. All of them wore the same collars around their necks and the same defeated look in their eyes. Daniel. Harper was separated from the others almost immediately. Valanthi guards dragged him down a different corridor while he shouted for his crew. They did not listen. They took him to a facility reserved for what they called leadership specimens. The Valanthi had learned over thousands of years that breaking the leaders first made everyone else easier to control. They had perfected their methods through countless conquests, and they believed no species could resist their techniques. The facility was cold and dark and smelled like chemicals that burned. The inside of Daniel's nose? They put him in a small cell with no windows and no furniture except a thin mat on the floor. For the first week, they simply left him alone. No food, no water, no contact with anyone. They wanted him weak and desperate before they began the real work. When they finally came for him, Daniel could barely stand. They dragged him to a room filled with strange machines and strapped him to a metal table. A Valanthi in white robes examined him like a scientist examining an insect. It spoke to him in that clicking voice, and the translator in his collar converted the words. It said that humans were fascinating creatures. It said that their capacity for hope was unusually strong. It said that this would make breaking him more interesting. The pain began, and it did not stop for a very long time. Meanwhile, the other colonists were transported to labor camps across the Dominion. Nathan Cole found himself in a crystalline mine on a moon orbiting a gas giant. The crystals they harvested were used to power Valanthy technology. They were found deep beneath the surface in tunnels filled with toxic gas. Workers wore thin masks that filtered some of the poison, but not enough. The shifts lasted 20 hours and the food was barely enough to survive. Nathan watched other slave species die in those tunnels. Creatures that had been enslaved for generations simply collapsed and never got up again. The Valanthy guards would drag their bodies away and replace them with new workers the next day. It was an endless cycle of death and suffering that had continued for thousands of years. But Nathan noticed something. The humans lasted longer. They complained less. They helped each other when the guards were not watching. They shared their food with the weakest among them and carried those who could not walk on their own. The other slave species watched this behavior with confusion. They had forgotten what solidarity meant. The Valanthy had beaten it out of them generations ago. Nathan began to build a network. He identified the humans who had been placed in different sections of the mine. He learned the patrol schedules of the guards. He mapped the tunnels and found places where they could meet without being observed. He taught the others to do the same. Information became their most valuable resource, and they gathered it constantly. Laura Mitchell was taken to a different facility entirely. The Valanthy had examined her skills during processing and decided she was too valuable for manual labor. They assigned her to a communications hub where they monitored transmissions from across their empire. Her job was to maintain equipment and run diagnostics under the supervision of Valanthy technicians. At first, Laura simply did what she was told. She kept her head down and her mouth shut and learned everything she could about Valanthy technology. The systems were more advanced than anything humans had built, but the underlying principles were similar. Data moved through networks. Signals traveled on frequencies. Encryption protected sensitive information. Laura had spent her entire career working with such systems, and she understood them. Instinctively, after several months, she began to take risks. She stayed late to study files she was not supposed to access. She memorized codes and passwords that the Valanthy technicians used carelessly in front of her. She learned the architecture of their military network and identified weaknesses that their programmers had never considered. She stored everything in her memory because she had no way to write it down. The phrase spread through the slave camps like fire through dry grass. Earth will come. Humans whispered it to each other during meal breaks. They scratched it into walls where the guards would not see. They taught it to their children who had been born in captivity and had never seen blue skies or green grass. Earth will come. It was a prayer and a promise and a reason to survive one more day. The Valanthy heard the phrase and they laughed. Their intelligence officers had studied human space extensively. They knew that Earth was a single planet with limited resources and primitive technology. The fastest human ships could barely reach nearby stars. There was no fleet coming. There was no rescue. The slaves were holding on to a fantasy, but the Valanthy did not understand humans. They had conquered many species, and all of those species had eventually accepted their fate. Some had taken years to break. Some had taken decades, but they all broke eventually. The Valanthy assumed humans would be the same because they could not imagine anything different. They did not know about human history. They did not know about the ice ages that had nearly wiped out the species. They did not know about the plagues that had killed millions and the wars that had destroyed civilizations. They did not know that humanity had faced extinction many times and had always come back stronger than before. Daniel Harper survived the facility for leadership specimens. It took them 2 years to realize he would not break. They tortured him with pain and isolation and drugs that twisted his mind, but he held on to something deep inside himself that they could not reach. Eventually they gave up and sent him to the mines like everyone else. They considered him a failure and moved on to other projects. When Daniel arrived at the mine, Nathan Cole was waiting for him. The two men embraced like brothers, even though they had barely known each other on the Endurance. Nathan told Daniel about the network he had built. He told him about the information they had gathered and the plans they had made. He told him that humans across the Dominion were preparing for the day when Earth would come. Daniel looked at his old crew member with eyes that had seen too much suffering. He asked how Nathan could be so certain that help was coming. Nathan smiled and said that he had faith. He said that humans did not abandon their own. He said that somewhere on Earth right now, someone was reading Laura's message and deciding what to do about it. He was right. The message had arrived on Earth 3 years after Laura sent it. It had taken 8 years to travel across the vast distance of space, and it had been received by the United Nations Space Command headquarters in Geneva. The people who read it had not laughed. The people who read it had not despaired. The people who read it had gotten very quiet, and then they had gotten very angry. In the mines and factories and slave camps of the Aonthi Dominion, the humans continued to wait and prepare. They did not know what was happening on Earth. They did not know that their message had been received. But they believed. And sometimes belief is enough to change the galaxy. Admiral Catherine Price sat alone in her office at the United Nations Space Command headquarters in Geneva. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the soft hum of computers processing data. On her desk was a tablet containing the transmission from the Endurance. She had watched it 47 times in the past week. She had memorized every frame, and every word, and every terrified face. The transmission showed alien ships surrounding a human vessel. It showed creatures with scales and claws boarding the ship and dragging people away in chains. It showed a communications officer named Laura Mitchell recording a desperate plea for help before being thrown to the ground by an alien soldier. The message ended with coordinates and a single sentence. Warn humanity. Catherine was 62 years old and had served in the military for 4 decades. She had seen combat on 3 continents and commanded fleets in exercises that simulated wars humanity hoped would never happen. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. Aliens were real. They had attacked human civilians. They had taken 3,000 people as slaves, and they had done it because they believed Earth was too weak to respond. She picked up her phone and called the Secretary General of the United Nations. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. By the end of it, every major government on the planet had been alerted. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Military commanders were summoned from their posts. Scientists were pulled from their laboratories. The most important project in human history was about to begin. The United Nations Security Council met in closed session the following week. Representatives from every nation sat around a massive table while Catherine Price played the transmission on a screen that covered an entire wall. No one spoke while it played. No one moved. When it ended, there was silence for a long moment. The Chinese ambassador was the first to speak. He said that this changed everything. The American ambassador agreed. The Russian ambassador nodded slowly. Old rivalries and ancient grudges suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of what they had just witnessed. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and the neighbors were hostile. The vote was unanimous. Every nation on Earth would contribute to a unified response. Military secrets that had been guarded for generations were declassified and shared. Research programs that competing powers had hidden from each other were combined. Budgets that had been fought over for decades were merged into a single fund with one purpose. Humanity would build a fleet capable of crossing the stars and bringing its people home. They called it the Terran Defense Initiative. Catherine Price was appointed as supreme commander of the project with authority that no military leader in history had ever held. She answered only to the Security Council, and the Security Council gave her everything she asked for. The first challenge was propulsion. Human ships could travel between planets, but crossing interstellar distances took decades. The Endurance had used experimental technology that was barely faster. If they wanted to reach the Valanthi Dominion in time, to make a difference they needed something revolutionary. Dr. Samuel Wright was a physicist who had spent 30 years studying theoretical faster-than-light travel. His colleagues considered him brilliant but impractical. His research had never received proper funding because no one believed it would work. Now he found himself leading a team of 12,000 scientists with unlimited resources and a single instruction: make it work. Samuel worked 20-hour days for 3 years. His team built prototype after prototype and watched them fail in spectacular ways. Some exploded. Some vanished without a trace. Some simply sat there doing nothing, no matter how much power they fed them. Each failure taught them something new. They recorded every lesson carefully. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd year. A small probe, no larger than a basketball, disappeared from a test chamber in Geneva and reappeared 3 seconds later in orbit around Mars. The team stared at the data in disbelief. They ran the test again. Same result. They ran it 100 more times and it worked every single time. Samuel called Catherine Price and told her they had done it. She asked how long before they could scale it up for warships. He said 2 years. She told him he had 18 months. While the scientists worked on propulsion, the military prepared for war. Factories that had built cars and planes and consumer goods were converted to produce weapons and armor and ships. Millions of workers learned new skills and took pride in knowing they were part of something historic. Young people enlisted in numbers that had not been seen since the great wars of the previous centuries. General Christina Howard was appointed to design the fleet. She was a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She had studied military history obsessively, and she understood that the weapons of the past would not work against an enemy. That had conquered 17 star systems. Christina designed ships that were built for destruction from the hull inward. The flagship was 3 kilometers long and bristled with weapons that merged human innovation with alien technology, recovered from secret encounters that governments had hidden from the public for decades. She named it Retribution. Its sister ships were called Defiance and Vengeance and Fury and Judgment. Each name was chosen to send a message. The fleet grew in secret shipyards hidden beneath the surface of the Moon and Mars. 400 warships took shape over the following years. Each one was crewed by volunteers who knew they might never return. Each one carried weapons capable of cracking planets. Each one was painted with the flag of the United Nations and the words, Terran Defense Force. Intelligence was equally important. Using the coordinates from Laura's transmission, they launched stealth probes toward Valenthia space. These probes were small and quiet and nearly invisible to sensors. They mapped star systems and monitored fleet movements and sent back information that helped the military planners prepare for what was coming. The probes also made contact with the human resistance. Nathan Cole's network had spread across the Dominion and they were desperate for communication with Earth. Coded messages hidden in routine. Transmissions began flowing between the slaves and their homeworld. The humans in captivity shared everything they knew about Valanthi. Defenses and fleet positions and the location of every human slave in the Empire. 11 years passed. The colonists of the Endurance had been slaves for more than a decade. Children had been born in captivity who had never seen Earth. Men and women had died in the mines and factories without knowing if their message had ever been received. But the survivors had not given up hope. They had continued to wait and prepare and believe on a morning that would change the galaxy forever. Admiral Catherine Price stood on the bridge of the Retribution. 400 warships surrounded her in formation. Millions of soldiers waited at their stations. The largest fleet humanity had ever built was ready to move. She opened a channel to every ship and spoke. In a voice that was calm and cold, she said that their people had been slaves for 11 years. She said that every cruelty would be answered. She said that no one in the galaxy would ever enslave a human being again. She told them to jump on her mark. The fleet activated its drives and vanished from the solar system. Earth had answered, and the Valanthi Dominion had no idea what was coming. The Valanthi sensor station at the edge of the Korak system detected the anomaly at exactly 1400 hours local time. The officer on duty was young and inexperienced, and he assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. The readings showed 400 massive objects appearing from nowhere in perfect formation. No species could move that many ships through faster than light travel simultaneously. No species had that kind of technology. He ran diagnostics on his sensors 3 times before accepting that the readings were accurate. By then it was already too late. He sent an alert to the military command center, but the message had barely left his station when the first human weapons fired. The Terran fleet attacked with a precision that the Valanthi had never witnessed. Railguns fired tungsten projectiles at speeds that turned simple metal into planet-killing weapons. Missiles carried warheads that tore apart the fabric of space itself around enemy vessels. Point defense systems created walls of fire that nothing could penetrate. The technology was decades beyond anything the Valanthi expected from the primitive species they had enslaved. Admiral Catherine Price stood on the bridge of the Retribution and watched the battle unfold on holographic displays. Her face showed no emotion as Valantha ships exploded one after another. She had waited 11 years for this moment. She had spent every day of those years preparing for exactly this. There was no joy in what she was doing. There was only cold determination to finish what the Valanthi had started. The Korak system fell in 6 hours. 42 Valantha warships were destroyed, along with 3 orbital installations. Human casualties were 0. The fleet did not pause to celebrate. They jumped again before the Valanthi could. Organize a response. News of the attack spread through the Dominion faster than the fleet moved. Communications networks carried reports of the impossible battle to every corner of the Empire. Military commanders demanded explanations that no one could provide. Politicians screamed at admirals who had no answers. The High Executor of the Valanthi Dominion summoned his council and demanded to know how a single primitive planet had built a fleet capable of destroying their forces. No one could tell him. They had studied humanity for years. They had monitored Earth's pathetic attempts at space exploration. They had laughed at human technology and human ambition and human hope. They had assumed that enslaving 3,000 colonists would have no consequences, because Earth could do nothing about it. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Terran fleet struck again and again over the following weeks. They targeted military installations and supply lines and communication relays. Each attack was surgically precise. Admiral Price had given strict orders that civilian populations were not to be harmed. Humanity was angry, but humanity was not genocidal. There was a difference, and she intended to demonstrate it. In the slave camps, word of the attacks spread like wildfire. Humans, who had spent years in chains, suddenly stood taller. They looked their overseers in the eyes for the first time since their capture. They whispered to each other that Earth had come. The promise they had held on to for 11 years was finally being fulfilled. Nathan Cole received the signal he had been waiting for through the coded communication network. The message was simple. Prepare for uprising. Coordinate with all human assets. Strike when the fleet reaches Valanthos Prime. He read it 3 times to make sure he understood, and then he began spreading the word. The rebellion ignited across the Dominion.
Simultaneously.
In mines and factories and processing facilities, humans rose up against their captors. They used tools as weapons. They used their knowledge of security routines to ambush guards. They freed other slaves and armed them with whatever they could find. The Valanthi had never anticipated coordinated resistance from livestock. Laura Mitchell made her move at the communications hub. She had spent years learning every system and memorizing every weakness. When the signal came, she acted without hesitation. She disabled the security protocols and locked the Valanthi technicians out of their own networks. She downloaded military codes and fleet positions in defensive. Layouts onto a data crystal the size of her thumb guards came for her, but she was already gone. She fought her way through corridors she had walked as a slave for 11 years. Other humans joined her as she moved. Some had weapons they had hidden. Some had only their fists and their fury. They reached a landing field where Valanthi shuttles sat waiting for pilots who would never arrive. Laura had learned to fly Valanthi craft during her years at the hub. She climbed into the cockpit of the nearest shuttle and powered up the engines. Alarms blared across the facility, but no one could stop her. She lifted off and aimed the shuttle toward the stars where she knew the human fleet was waiting. The Retribution received her transmission as she approached. Admiral Price ordered a fighter escort to bring her in safely. When Laura landed in the shuttle bay, she was greeted by soldiers who saluted her like a hero. She ignored them and walked straight to the bridge with the data crystal clutched in her hand. She handed it to Admiral Price and spoke for the first time in years without fear. She said that everything was on the crystal. Every ship, every base, every weakness the Volanthi had tried to hide. She said it was time to end this. Admiral Price took the crystal and inserted it into the tactical computer. Information flooded the displays. Fleet positions, defense grid layouts, communication frequencies, patrol schedules. It was everything they needed to deliver tea. Final blow. The Admiral studied the data for a long moment. Then she looked at Laura and thanked her. She said that what Laura had done would save countless lives. She asked if Laura wanted to rest before the final battle. Laura shook her head. She said she had rested enough. She said she wanted to watch. The fleet jumped to Volanthos Prime. The Volanthos Prime hung in space like a blue and silver jewel, surrounded by hundreds of warships and orbital defense platforms. It was the most heavily defended location in the entire Dominion. The Volanthi believed it was impregnable. They were wrong. Admiral Price opened a channel to every ship in her fleet. She told them that this was the moment they had trained for. She told them that their brothers and sisters were down on that planet waiting to be freed. She told them to show the Volanthi what happened when you enslaved humanity. The battle began with a volley of railgun fire that lit up the darkness of space. Volanthi ships moved to intercept, but they were too slow and too predictable. Human tactical officers had studied their formations for years through the intelligence network. They knew where every enemy ship would be before it got there. Explosions bloomed across the Volanthi defensive line. Ships that had conquered worlds shattered like glass under the human assault. Orbital platforms that had stood for centuries crumbled and fell toward the planet below. The Dominion was learning a lesson that would echo through galactic history. Humanity had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The Battle of Volanthos Prime lasted 3 days. It was the largest military engagement in galactic history, and it ended with the complete destruction of the Volanthi war fleet. Ships that had terrorized the galaxy for 12,000 years burned in the darkness of space. Stations that had processed millions of slaves crumbled into debris. The empire that had believed itself invincible learned what it meant to face an enemy that would not stop. Admiral Catherine Price commanded the battle from the bridge of the Retribution. She had not slept in 40 hours, but her eyes remained sharp and her orders remained precise. Every move the Volanthi made had been anticipated. Every tactic they tried had been countered. The intelligence Laura Mitchell had provided gave the human fleet an advantage that the Dominion could not overcome. Volanthi commanders called for reinforcements from their other territories. Those reinforcements never came. Rebellions had spread to every corner of the empire as species that had been enslaved for millennia saw their chance for freedom. The Volanthi were fighting on 100 fronts at once and losing on all of them. On the surface of Volanthos Prime, the ground assault began. Dropships carrying human soldiers descended through the atmosphere while orbital bombardment cleared their landing zones. Daniel Harper was among the first wave. He had volunteered for the mission despite his age and his injuries, and no one had tried to stop him. He had earned the right to be there. Daniel led a company of soldiers toward the central slave processing facility. It was the same building where he had been cataloged and numbered 11 years ago. The same building where he had watched his crew dragged away in chains. He remembered every corridor and every room and every moment of humiliation he had suffered there. The Velanathi. Guards fought desperately, but they were no match for human soldiers equipped with weapons designed specifically to kill them. Daniel moved through the facility like a ghost of vengeance. He did not speak. He did not hesitate. He simply advanced, and the enemy fell before him. They reached the main holding area where thousands of humans waited. These were the original colonists of the Endurance, along with the children who had been born in captivity. They looked up at the soldiers with eyes that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. Some of them recognized Daniel, despite the years and the scars. He stood before them and spoke in a voice that cracked with emotion. He said that Earth had come. He said they were going home. He said that no one would ever hurt them again. A child who had never seen Earth asked what home looked like. Daniel knelt down and told her about blue skies and green grass and oceans that stretched to the horizon. He told her about cities filled with people who had worked for 11 years to bring them back. He told her that she would see it all very soon. The High Executor of the Volanthi Dominion requested terms of surrender on the third day of the battle. His fleet was destroyed. His armies were scattered. His empire was crumbling around him. He had no choice but to ask for mercy from the species he had tried to enslave. Admiral Price received him aboard the Retribution in a conference room, where humanity had once dreamed of peaceful first contact. The High Executor was smaller than she had expected. His scales had lost their shimmer, and his forearms hung limply at his sides. He looked like a creature that had already accepted defeat. She told him what humanity demanded. Every human being in the Dominion would be released immediately. Every slave of every species would be freed. The Volanthi war fleet would be dismantled permanently. Reparations would be paid to every world the Dominion had conquered, and the Volanthi would never attempt to enslave another sentient being for as long as their civilization existed. The High Executor asked, What would happen if his people refused? Admiral Price leaned forward and spoke in a voice that contained no warmth. She said that humanity would continue until there was nothing left of Volanthi civilization but a warning to others. She said that humans did not conquer because they chose not to. She said that humans built their strength on cooperation rather than domination. She said that when the Volanthi threatened human lives, they united every person on Earth in a single purpose. She stood and looked down at the creature who had caused so much suffering. She told him that humanity had arrived, would not leave until justice was done. The High Executor signed the surrender documents that afternoon. The Volanthi Dominion collapsed within a year. The species they had enslaved formed new governments and built new societies. They looked toward futures that had been denied them for generations. Many of them asked humanity to stay and help them rebuild. Humanity accepted, not as conquerors, but as allies. The Terran fleet remained in former Dominion, space to protect the newly freed peoples from any who might try to fill the power vacuum. Human engineers helped rebuild infrastructure. Human doctors treated the sick and injured. Human teachers shared knowledge that had been forbidden under Volanthi rule. The former slaves of the Endurance turned to Earth as heroes. Crowds lined the streets of every major city to welcome them home. World leaders gave speeches praising their courage and endurance. Monuments were planned and holidays were declared. Nathan Cole became the first director of the Terran Interstellar Security Force. His job was to ensure that no species would ever be enslaved again. He built a network of allies across the galaxy who shared that mission. He trained new generations of officers who would carry on his work long after he was gone. Laura Mitchell led the effort to share human technology with their new allies. She believed that knowledge should unite rather than divide. She established schools on dozens of worlds where beings of all species could learn together. She never forgot what it felt like to be powerless, and she dedicated her life to making sure others never felt that way. Daniel Harper retired to a small house on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He spent his days watching the waves and his nights watching the stars. Sometimes old friends would visit, and they would talk about what they had survived and what they had built. Sometimes he would simply sit alone with his memories. On clear nights, he would look up at the sky and remember the day when alien ships had surrounded his vessel and declared humanity to be property. He would remember the years of suffering and the desperate hope that had kept them alive. He would remember the moment when human warships appeared in the sky, above Volanthos Prime, and everything changed. He would smile because he knew something the Volanthi had never understood. Humanity did not kneel. Humanity did not break. Humanity remembered every wound and answered every injustice. And when humanity arrived, the galaxy itself learned to tremble. The stars belonged to everyone now. Humanity had made sure of that. And somewhere in the vastness of space, other civilizations heard the story of what happened to the Volanthi Dominion. They heard about the small blue planet that had built a war fleet in 11 years. They heard about the species that crossed the stars to rescue 3,000 of their own. They heard and they understood. Humanity was not to be enslaved. Humanity was not to be threatened. Humanity was to be respected. Because when you hurt one human, you hurt them all. And when you hurt them all, they come for you with a fury that cannot be stopped. That was the lesson the galaxy learned. That was the legacy humanity left among the stars. And that was how the story ended. Not with conquest, but with justice. Not with domination, but with freedom. Not with hatred, but with the simple truth that every being deserves to live without chains. Humanity had arrived, and the universe was better for it.